Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining this session today. My name is Jeremy. I'm one of the newest board members here at the Next Niagara Council. Today, I have with me Bex McKnight. She's about to hop on in a second. There she is. Hey, Bex. Before I pass it over to her, I'll give you guys a quick introduction of who she is. With over 10 years of experience in diversity training and design, Bex develops materials and brand strategies that are compassionate, accessible, and inclusive for organizations such as universities, government agencies, nonprofits, and small businesses. She provides consultation services for those looking to promote diversity and inclusion within their organization, with an emphasis on the importance of design as a catalyst for social change. And I think I did see yesterday that you are one of the new winners for 40 under 40. So congratulations.
Thank you.
So
Yeah,
no
it's really
worries.
exciting.
That's a great award. So I'll just pass it off and we can get started.
Great. All right, let me share my screen and we'll just hop right in. So like Jeremy said, my name is Bex McKnight. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the creative director of McKnight Inclusive Design. This is exactly what Jeremy just read, but I'll read it again. So basically what we do here at MID is use graphic and web design and consulting to help make businesses more inclusive and accessible. We also offer consulting services to help businesses who are looking to become more inclusive and accessible and don't know where to start. So just quickly, some of our clients, I'm sure you might recognize some of the logos there. We've got a bunch of universities, the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, lots of Niagara-based businesses as well, like Barter Pay and the Niagara Orchard Vineyard Co., Liberty Cycles, Wandering Spirits, and some really cool big ones like Ace Universe, who are in charge of Comic-Con. So just to start off the presentation, I want to say that as professionals, I think that we all have a social responsibility to ensure that all the work we produce is ethical. And that's the very basic starting point, I think, for this presentation and for all of the work that we do here at MID. And sorry, the transcript just stopped, so I'm just making sure that's running. So one of the things I think is really important to do, and you'll notice I do this throughout the presentation, is I will read what's on the screen. We've probably been taught in school that that's the worst style of presentation, but from an accessibility standpoint, it's actually really important because you never know what sort of assistive technology or device someone might be using to engage with this presentation. So I'm going to start by just doing a quick overview of what is or just disability in general and who's affected. So we often think of disability as that kind of human health condition. So that's a person in a wheelchair, that's a person who's blind. But I think we can take a more critical lens when we talk about disability and think of disability as the disabling environment around us. So that's how have we constructed and built our world, whether that's digital or physical, in a way that disables people, that puts them at a disadvantage. And so I like to say that disability is actually mismatched human interactions and environments. And so here you can see the little graphic is a person in a wheelchair and they're trying to go down a steep curve, but there's no ramp. So that person is at a disadvantage because there hasn't been a built environment that accommodates them, not because they're in a wheelchair. So it's just a little bit of a different reframe as we think about disability throughout the presentation. So who's affected? Well, 1 in 5 people worldwide have some form of impairment that prevents them from accessing our world in an equal way. And actually in Canada, that's closer to 1 in 4 and same in the US. So that's like 25% of people. And when we talk about disability, it's important to keep in mind that disability can affect anyone at any time and can change. So you can have a permanent disability or be permanently in a disabling situation. It can be temporary or it can be situational. So a little graphic here, and I'm going to talk through all the graphics again because someone might not be able to see them. So for permanent, we have a person who has one arm and one arm missing. We have a temporary disability, so that's a person with an arm injury in a sling. And situational, that's a new parent who might have to always be holding a baby in one arm and therefore only has one arm that they're able to engage with their environment in. And in general, we talk about dimensions of access. And so that includes things like your vision, your hearing, your cognitive ability, and your mobility. So we'll keep those in mind as we talk through. And there are a lot more dimensions of access, but that's what we're going to talk about here today. So what's inclusive design and why should we use it? Inclusive design is design that considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. So again, all those dimensions of access and basically all the ways in which we differ person to person. And when we design inclusively, here are some of the things that we're trying to achieve through those designs. So we're trying to provide a comparable experience among people. We're trying to consider the situation that each person individually is in. We're trying to be consistent, clear, and direct with our messaging and our communication. We're trying to give the end user or the person engaging with content or environments control. They should be able to control the way in which they engage with that environment. And by extension, offer them choices as to how they'd like to engage. We prioritize the content over the meaning or over the design aesthetic, for example. And at the end of the day, inclusive design really does aim to add value to anything that you're doing. And the little graphic over here on the side just kind of implies that inclusive design is where accessibility and usability kind of come together in a human-centered way. So this quote I really, really like. It's one of the UK's design principles for their entire country. So it says, accessible design is good design. Everything we build should be as inclusive, legible, and readable as possible. If we have to sacrifice elegance, so be it. We're building for needs, not for audiences. We're designing for the whole country, not just those who are used to using the web. The people who most need our services are often the people who find them the hardest to use. So let's think about those people from the start. And that's where I think we should always start with when you're designing things, when you're creating content, when you're creating forms, when you're doing that social media post, when you're doing a presentation deck, always start from a place of empathy. So quickly, let's touch on some of the benefits of designing inclusively. So basically summed up, if you solve for one person, you can extend that to many people. So inclusive design can actually, it's proven that it can reach up to 4 times more users by lowering the barrier to entry to engage with content. So basically by making products and content easier to use, more people can use them and they will use it. Inclusive design is often a key to innovating new products and services. 2 super quick examples, the pinch to zoom functionality on your phone, on your iPad, that was an accessibility feature that now we use for tons of things, photo editing, to look at details. And the voice to text also was an accessibility feature that now we can use to do things like create on the fly transcriptions and captions for our social media videos. So it's just one of those things where when someone was trying to think of a way to solve a problem for someone who might be vision impaired, they created a solution, and now we widely use that solution for lots of things every day. And finally, inclusive design can strengthen communities. So like I kind of just said, inclusive design affects more than just the populations that they target. So for example, curb cuts are those things that when you meet a sidewalk and it kind of slides down onto the road so that you don't have this like jagged edge. Those were obviously designed for people with mobility devices, but someone pushing a stroller, a skateboarder, all of those people benefit from something that was originally designed to as an accommodation. Same with high contrast screens, another great example. And what are the costs of not designing inclusively? I think this is as important. So we say alienation, which is removing entire segments of the market, which can decrease your potential customer base, result in lost profits. Basically, if you're not allowing everybody to access your content, to buy your item online, to engage with your social media content, to fill out a form on your website, that's a customer you could have potentially lost. And poor brand reputation, of course. Companies are constantly getting hit for not being socially responsible. And so I think leadership comes from within, and setting yourself up for leadership can only have a positive brand reputation. Obviously, increased expenditures. If you don't design inclusively from the start, it is much more expensive to remediate later on. So they say that retrofitting things or remediating content that isn't accessible can cost up to 10 times more than the original cost of just implementing inclusive design principles from the start. So that could be, if $1,000 project, that could be a $10,000 remediation. So it's always best to start with an accessibility and inclusivity plan whenever you're planning a new project. And recently, litigation. So here in Ontario specifically, and widely across the United States, users now have the right to litigate against companies who do not provide them with accessible ways to access content, especially when it comes to web accessibility. In Ontario, we have what's called the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And there are specific guidelines that you need to meet if you have a website in Ontario. And those actually go into effect by June 30th. And if you are not compliant by June 30th, you can face hefty penalties. I think it's like $5,000 a day for some companies. So it is significant and definitely worth looking into. So a lot of you are probably content creators for your organizations or for yourselves even. So let's talk first about how to create more accessible content, and really why should we use accessible content? So when we're designing accessibly, I'm going to go through a bunch of actual design elements and considerations first. So when we're designing content like a social media post, for example, a poster maybe, there are a few things that we want to keep in mind when we design. Also keeping in mind those dimensions of access we talked about earlier, the vision, hearing, cognitive mobility. So these kind of touch on all of those things. So first we've got visual hierarchy and focus, which basically includes alignment, proximity, size, space, case sensitivity for text, color, contrast, and typography. Then you've got assistive context, and we're going to break each of these down. Assistive context, that's things that help a user engage with the content. So captions, subtitles, transcripts, alternative text, also called alt text, image descriptions, and alternative formats. And then, of course, the user experience and the interactivity of any given content. So that's your animation, movement, navigation, and predictable outcomes. So let's break each of those down a little further. So visual hierarchy and focus. These are basically your like top level tips for when you're designing things. And I tried to keep them as simple as possible so you can just come back to them, refer back to these slides whenever you need to. So these are best practices, of course. There might be times where you won't be able to incorporate all of these things. You know, you might have established brand guidelines that go against some of these principles, in which case I'd say maybe time to update those. But let's talk through some of them. So alignment and line length, best practices. So always try and keep a clear structure to the content that you're creating. So use titles, use subheadings, and keep paragraphs that are longer than 2 lines left aligned. It's actually very difficult visually to read long paragraphs of text that are not left aligned. Our brains just kind of can't compute things. So, you know, I often see websites that are built with long strings of text, like right down the middle, because you think that like, oh, if it's in the middle of the page, your eye will focus on it. But the jagged lines that you end up with on either side of a center aligned paragraph are very difficult for some people to process, to visually process. And your eyes get fatigued and it's harder to read, and then you give up. So in that way, you also want to keep a grid structure when you're organizing information, create columns, create, you know, rules of third, and keep your line lengths for text to 50 to 150 characters. Any longer than that, and your brain tends to skim content, and you're going to be missing out on key elements. The next one is proximity and space. So again, kind of in line with keeping the structure, you want to group related elements together. So if you're making a list, for example, you don't want a bullet here and a bullet here and a bullet here and all over. You want to keep them in a nice list so that people understand that those elements are related to a singular concept. And in that sense, also give your content room to breathe. Don't clutter it, don't smush it together, don't try to fit more on a page than you need to, especially in the digital world. Space is infinite. So if you need an extra page, if you need an extra 2 pages, so that the content can breathe and be more intelligible, I would definitely recommend that. Perfect example is this slide. Between each of the subheadings, I used a big space. So you can clearly delineate between each subheading and each grouping of bullets. And don't overlay text on low contrast or visually complex backgrounds. So don't use that like crazy patterned background and then try and overlay a ton of text on it. Your eyes won't be able to focus, and someone will likely just skip right over it because it becomes that visual clutter. And we're constantly inundated with visual clutter, so you want to stand out. And very easily, size and orientation. So the largest elements of any content should contain the highest level of information. Perfect example, the title at the top. this is the title of the slide. This is the topic we are talking about. Then you have slightly smaller subheadings and slightly smaller body text. And you want to orient objects and information in predictable and consistent ways. So, don't flip text upside down, for example. Your brain isn't wired to be able to read that easily. And at the end of the day, you want to make the content as easily digestible as possible. Color and contrast. We're going to continue with visual hierarchy and focus. So color and contrast. My recommendation and the Web Accessibility Guidelines recommendation is to never use color as the only way to communicate information. You should always use a secondary method. So something like an underline, an outline, change the font style to bold or italic, or some other sort of visual identifier. Because if someone's colorblind, they may not be able to actually understand what you're trying to communicate. And that goes for things like graphs too. People often will use color as the only differentiator on a graph. So think of in terms of using a label, use an arrow, use anything you can to visually differentiate that information. If you're familiar with it, you can use principles of color psychology to help you with those differentiators as well. And always use high contrast color combinations. And I have here that currently meet the WCAG 2.1 AA guidelines. Those are the current web accessibility guidelines as they stand, and they are required here in Ontario. You can look them up. You can click that link on the slide later. If you're curious, there are color combinations and color contrast ratios that are required for 3 different levels: for body text, for what's considered large text, and normal text. And they all have different ratios, so it's worth checking out. And you can use lots of online checkers to basically assist you with figuring out if the content you've created meets those contrast ratios. And typography. So some quick definitions. You might have heard typography, typeface, font. So what do they all mean? So typography is the group of typefaces and fonts. That typography is the styles of fonts that you use. A typeface is a family of fonts. So something like Arial, Times New Roman, Calibri. A font is a specific weight or style of that typeface. So for example, Times New Roman bold is a font. That's important. It's an important distinction for when we talk about how to pair fonts or typefaces together. I always say that if you don't know how to pair them together, if you're not versed in typography or in graphic design, start with really, really simple ones that everyone's familiar with. Pair a sans serif font. So first of all, serif is the little tail on a letter. In something like Times New Roman, for example, those little tails on the end of letters, those are serifs. So it's a really easy combination to pair one sans serif and one serif font together, and stick with ones that are we're really familiar with, ones that came native with Microsoft Word way back in the day. Those are generally also accepted as the more accessible fonts because we're so familiar with seeing them. And when you're familiar with seeing visual information, you don't have to your brain doesn't have to work as hard because you're already familiar and used to being able to read those individual glyphs and letters. Here I have Calibri, Verdana, Helvetica, Tahoma, Times New Roman, Arial. Those are all great fonts to start with if you don't know how to look for specifically accessible fonts. And finally, make sure you're using your capital letters sparingly. Only for short titles. I usually say no more than a few words. Screen readers have a really, really difficult time reading caps. So if you have more than a few words written in capital letters, when someone's using a screen reader, it just sounds like nuts to listen to. So you're just really doing them a favor. Not a favor. You're being as accessible as you can. And I really do believe that with the right tools, anyone can create accessible content. Use these guidelines, take some of the content you already have, practice remediating it. Remediating just means fixing it. And sometimes it can just take a few easy tweaks to make the content you have accessible, and just take a mind to that content. So I'm going to show you a super quick example. So on the left, we have, a typical social media post, maybe one of those quote cards. And it says, it's a really busy kind of watercolor blue background. And it says, all in caps, be a digital accessibility leader in your industry by advocating for inclusion and leading by example. Then there's a space, And then in lowercase letters, it says accessibility matters for everyone. We should all aim to create content that is accessible. And once you know the basics, it's easy to incorporate into your workflow. So some things right off the bat that I think are just not accessible about this at all. The busy background, the really low contrast, that's the low difference between the background color and the white text overlaid on it. It's kind of hard to see. There are parts of the image that are really bright, like they're almost white. And so the white text kind of fades into that. So it's harder to see. There's a lot of text written in caps. Again, that's going to be really difficult for a screen reader. There's also not a lot of space around the text compared to the border of the image. So it feels really heavy, like visually heavy. It feels weighed down. It's all center aligned. And so again, you're getting those kind of ragged edges of the text. So your eye doesn't really know like where it should be balancing between. So when I look at content, like those are just some of the things that I noticed right off the bat. So over here, I just took that and on the left created what I think is a little bit of a pared down, more accessible version. So we've darkened the background to make it less busy. It's the same background, it's just darker. We've created a clear hierarchy in terms of structure of titles. So it's it says be a digital accessibility leader in your industry. That's a very clear title. The subtitle then becomes by advocating for inclusion and leading by example. Everything is left aligned. It's a lot easier to read. The text is smaller and there's a lot more space around it. So again, your eye knows exactly where to focus on when you're reading. It's very clear that there's a differentiation between the title, the subtitle, and the body text as well. So really making things accessible just took I did this in like less than a minute. It took no real effort. It just took time to learn how to do it. And I think once you kind of have your best practices, you will automatically start creating accessible content because you just know what those best practices are. So that's just a quick example. So we'll move on. So the next dimension we want to talk about when we're creating content is how to improve the way that people engage with that content if they do require some sort of accommodation or assistive device. So assistive context is just anything that assists someone in being able to engage with that content. So subtitles and captions are the things that we often talk about, especially for video content, for webinars, meetings. So subtitles, and they are different. So let's talk about them. So subtitles are for viewers or users who do not speak the native language of the speaker in the video. What we have today in this webinar are captions, and those are for viewers who can see the video, but they can't hear the audio. And there are two types of captions. There's open captions, which are always on, and as a user, you can't turn them off. And then closed captions are what we're most frequently used to, where you can enable or disable them by the viewer. So again, that goes back to one of the earlier principles of always giving people options as to how they'd like to engage with the content. Platforms like YouTube and Instagram now have native captioning built right in. So you can review the captions before you post the content to catch any mistakes. They're not perfect. Auto-generated captions are getting a lot better, but they're not perfect. So I always recommend reading through them just to make sure that you pick up on any typos or misread words. And most webinar platforms also have captioning available like we have today. So I always recommend before you jump in to anything, learn how to use the captioning features of all the apps that you use, figure out where they are, how to enable them. And some apps even offer transcription. Again, Zoom, we have live transcription here today. So if that's something you are using right now, that's great. And if it's something you've never heard of, I encourage you to go and look up what live transcription is. It will basically pop a document in the side chat of everything that I'm saying right now. Again, not super perfect, but for people who might be using a screen reader or who might read at a slower rate, it's a lot easier to read a transcript at their own pace than to read captions. So having both options available just helps make things more accessible to a wider audience. And so some captioning and apps extensions for things that don't have native captioning. Capwing is great. It's a browser. It's a browser-based captioning tool. You can even create you can pay for it and create stylized and branded captions. So your captions look super on brand and cool. Clipchamp is an iPhone app and for the browser. It's good for IG stories and TikTok videos. And if you're really in a pinch, you can always use the voice to text memo feature on your phone. So basically just speak whatever you want into your phone and it will just create text, and then you can copy and paste that into the body of whatever other captioning software you might be using. Two other things for assistive context, helping people understand what's in images. So if someone is vision impaired, or even if they have, we think about dimensions of access. If someone has super slow internet, for example, images on websites that are really heavy might not load properly. And so if you're only relying on images to communicate information, someone could be missing a lot. So one way you can mitigate that is by giving alt text for images, providing alt text for your images and image descriptions in your captions. So alt text, or alternative text, is read aloud by assistive technology like a screen reader, and it describes what's in the image, and you write it yourself. Best practice is to keep it brief, but specifically describe what's in the image. So if there's text in the image, like if it's overlaid on the image, you should also include that text in the alt text. You don't need to include image of or picture of. A screen reader will already say that it's an image, so you can just take that right out of your alt text. And if the image is only decorative, if it's like a fancy border, or like an arrow that doesn't really do anything or serve a communicative purpose, you don't have to actually give it alt text. And sometimes if you do, it can be really distracting for someone using a screen reader, because like they don't want to, who wants to hear like image of decorative pink border? Like it doesn't really add value. Remember the adding value part. So if the image conveys important information, like a graph, it would be a lot to describe an entire graph. So really the alt text then becomes, what's the takeaway from the graph? Is that with graph showing data trending up? Like that could be a perfect alt text for that. And alt text can be added, if you don't know, it can be added for social media posts as well, on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Some of them, it's in the advanced options, and sometimes for Instagram, for example, once you post, you can go in and edit the alt text right by just editing the post itself. You can add alt text. Image descriptions and alt text are often conflated, but they are totally different. Image descriptions you might see in social media posts, for example, and they follow, the main caption underneath the post, and usually they're square bracketed and it says image description or description of image. And the image description is for the purpose of providing meaningful context to the image. So it doesn't necessarily have to describe the image in the same way that alt text does, in a very like matter-of-fact way. You can have fun with it, you can play with it. And I'm going to show you an example of how they differ. So here is my example image, and I'm going to read exactly what I wrote for the alt text and the image description, which will be helpful if anyone is using a screen reader right now. So the alt text I wrote is a group of 5 men sitting in the back of a van wearing banana costumes. Very simple. If you close your eyes, you can probably imagine what that looks like on, a very base level. The image description can be more playful and fun. It's where you can kind of add your brand voice to things. So I wrote, there's always money in the banana van. The 5 of us sitting in the back of our van with the doors peeled open, wearing shades, ripening in the sun in our banana costumes. So it still conveys exactly what the alt text does. It still tells you there's 5 people sitting in the back of a van wearing banana costumes, but you can have a little more fun with it. There's some banana puns in there. There's, like a reference to Arrested Development. So you can kind of show your personality more in the image description. And finally, there's the user experience and interactivity of content. So a lot of this is for web development and form specific. So if you are using animation, like let's say in an Instagram story or a video, keep it simple and subtle, and avoid anything that flashes or moves unpredictably, because those can induce seizures in some people. For navigation, you want to make consistent use of titles, headings, and subtitles, and ensure that your forms always display field titles, because as someone using a screen reader or an assistive device will use a different navigation tool. So they want to know what field they're filling out. Is this the name field? Is this the email field? So make it very clear. There are also forms, PDF form accessibility checkers you can use, and make sure if you're using web content, you can navigate the web content without a mouse. There are lots of things that can help you do that. And finally, for everything, for always creating content, be predictable. Don't do weird things that someone might not know how to interact with. And use visual cues in a predictable way. For example, a perfect example, we're very used to seeing like a blue underline as implying that there is a link. So you're going to click on that and it's going to go somewhere. Don't just underline text in blue if it's not a link, because the accepted practice is that links are underlined in blue. So do things in predictable ways. And if you have to do something that's in an unpredictable way, make sure that there is some sort of comment there that tells the user what is going to happen. So if a user clicks on something and doesn't expect, let's say, a secondary video window to open because they think it's going to load in the current window, just say opens in new window so that they can make the choice as to whether or not they would like to click on that then. So here's some quick tips for creating more inclusive digital spaces. So social media, and some of these we've already talked about, but I thought I would break it down by kind of area. So social media, you want to add your alt text to your images, include image descriptions, and caption your videos. You can even create transcripts that people can download later. Use camel case for hashtags. So that's basically where every separate word in a hashtag is capitalized. That is specifically for screen readers, because a screen reader doesn't know how to differentiate between words in a hashtag unless you use capital letters. You want to write in plain language, avoid jargon, slang, and highly technical terms, and use descriptive call to action. So don't say click here. That doesn't tell a user what they're doing or where they're going. Use sign up now, for example. When you've got presentations and meetings, use the accessibility checker that's native to most programs like PowerPoint to run through your presentation, see if there are any errors, see if there are things you can easily fix. Just like in this webinar, enable captioning and transcripts. Be clear and communicate about what accessibility accommodations are going to be available for your attendees before the presentation, and ask if there are any additional accommodations people require. And like I've been doing, speak the text on the screen out loud and describe the images as you present. It's just a best practice. When you're creating forms and documents, again, you can use the accessibility checker that's native to a lot of programs. Create all your forms as fillable documents. Again, it's a lot easier for someone using assistive technology to fill out something that's fillable. Make sure your fields have labels, add your alt text. And if you have the capacity, make sure that you have documents available in different formats, like large text for someone who might have a visual impairment. Use fonts like Open Dyslexic. If you even have the capacity, offer them in Braille if that's part of your audience. And this is not necessarily a design choice, but I always recommend to be compassionate when you're creating forms and documents, and only ask for the disclosure of information that is necessary to the conducting of your business. Don't ask for people's personal medical information if you don't need it. Don't even ask for their little like married moniker, like the Mr. or Mrs. Ms. Like that's none of your business. It doesn't really matter, and it doesn't affect what you're going to do or sell them in any way. And for some people, that can be really sensitive and traumatic information to share. And websites is like a whole other presentation, but some super quick ones. Use an accessibility checker on your website to run a high-level test to see if it meets the current Ontario WCAG 2.1 guidelines. If it doesn't, make a remediation plan. You can take care of some of the simple issues in-house, and when you can't, obviously defer to an expert who can help you. And from there, create an internal accessibility guide. So when you are adding new content to your site, everyone's on the same page about how you go about doing that and what the best accessibility practices are. And complete an annual website audit just to make sure that it's staying accessible and that you're staying abreast of all the changes to legislation. And some general tips for just creating digital spaces and content that's more inclusive. Use inclusive language. Avoid ableist language, use gender neutral pronouns and terms when you're talking about people. Use diverse and empowering imagery, and share content from diverse groups of content creators with your audience to amplify their voices. And whenever you're creating content or viewing content even, use a critical lens. Before you post that stuff, really evaluate what you've created, what you've written, for any assumptions, any biases, or limited points of view, and really try to engage with that discomfort and fix it. And since this is all about leadership, how can you advocate for accessibility within your own organization? Well, you can learn the ropes, you can do the work, and then you can advocate. So right now you're educating yourself. Way to go. You can also educate yourself about accessibility legislation through the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Guidelines and the Web Accessibility Guidelines. I always recommend that when you start, take an audit of what you've got. You might have really great content and it only needs a few tweaks, and that could be like a fun little weekend project. And make sure that you also are auditing the content creation process as much as you're auditing the content itself. Establish those best practices, write it all up in an accessibility document you can pass on to other employees, to new employees, make it part of a training and onboarding process. Use those inclusive design principles in your content creation, and teach and encourage others around you to do the same. And develop that digital accessibility policy, and engage with people living with disabilities, engage with diverse groups of people, ask them for feedback, ask them to test your content, and make sure you're compensating them for doing it. And if you hit a wall, break that shit down with numbers. One of the easiest things to sell when it comes to accessibility is the stats, is the numbers, is the money at the end of the day. So if you feel like you're hitting a roadblock at your organization and this is something that's really important to you, talk those numbers up with people who can make decisions. And I've included a bunch of really important numbers. So I'll read them out right now. So 1 in 4 people in Canada have some sort of impairment that prevents them from engaging with your digital content. That could be buying a product, filling out a form, or reading a social post, for example. In Canada, people living with disabilities are the 3rd largest market segment. That's huge, with a purchasing power of $55 billion annually. And when you combine that with the purchasing power of their friends and family and support networks, that's $366 billion. Globally, that's $1 trillion. So that is like some major numbers, major numbers. That's money that is not in your pocket, if you need to reframe that. 1 in 3 seniors lives with a disability, and they are the fastest growing market segment, with currently over 40% of Ontario's consumer base, and that's only going to grow as boomers age. So again, if you are not creating content that can be accessed by seniors, then you are behind the ball. So digital accessibility remediation, like I said before, can cost up to 10 times more than the original cost of the project. Accessibility does cost more money. It takes specialists, it takes specialized knowledge and education and tools and testing. But if you don't do it from the start, it's going to cost you more money. And if you end up in litigation, it's going to cost you a lot more money. And on the plus side, 55% of consumers surveyed are willing to pay more for products and services that come from ethical and socially responsible companies. So if you can position your organization as a leader in accessibility, a leader in inclusivity, if you can use that social capital to sell your products and services, like, why not? You're also just doing the right thing in the process. And if you take nothing away from this, refer back to this slide. These are the 4 pillars of creating inclusive content. So when you are making new content, when you are auditing content, when you are looking at content, looking at digital spaces, just look at these 4 things. So recognize that the average user does not exist. Treat every user with trust, respect, and dignity. Provide opportunities to engage in meaningful ways with the content, and strive to produce content that at the end of the day is valuable. And how does that break down? Super quickly. So provide opportunities to engage with content in meaningful ways. If you're creating a slide deck, do a voiceover or video of the presentation along with captions that someone can download after. Create alternative formats for the handouts that accompany that presentation in large print or open dyslexic. If you're doing user or product research, create user personas. Those are like those kind of those identity categories. If we think of like, who's our ideal client, who's our ideal user, use them, create them with personas that have a limitation, like has red-green color blindness, has broken wrist, has dial-up internet, so their internet loads really slowly, and see how that actually changes the product, because I think you'll be really surprised. strive to produce content that's valuable. So when you're creating social media posts, create content that uses accessibility best practices and share content made for and by users with disabilities with your audience to help amplify their voices. And of course, treat every user with trust, respect, and dignity. So if you're creating a form, like I already mentioned, be compassionate when you're asking for sensitive demographic data, and use the accessibility checker in something like Adobe PDF Reader to remediate your current forms and to review your newly created ones. And so we just talked about the tiny little blue section of the dimensions of access today. But what we do here at MID is actually everything in these other ones, these other overlapping rounded squares. So when we talk about dimensions of access, we're looking at vision, hearing, cognitive mobility. Those are the kinds of things we talked about today. We briefly touched on some of the other identity categories, but they would be race and ethnicity, location, gender, language, education, culture, religion, faith, sexual orientation, marital status, and age. So when we're talking about forms, for example, that's where your overlapping identity categories can come in. And our intersectional model here at McKnight Inclusive Design also includes the intersections of things like intelligence, victimhood, power and position, mental health and wellness, nationality and status, and socioeconomic status. So when we're designing, we try and look at the intersections of all of these identity categories to create the most inclusive and holistic products and services we can. And now I have a ton of resources that you can click on. So I've got guidelines, captions, transcripts, and screen readers, accessibility checkers, a big list of diverse imagery and stock photo sites. Some of them are free, some of them are paid, but I really encourage you when you're creating content to be critical of the imagery that you're using. Images are so powerful, and try and diversify the kinds of people, the kinds of environments, the kinds of bodies that you're showing. And a bonus resource from us, if you go to the download link, you can download a pack of free social media templates that we've designed for you that are totally accessible. So we've done all the work. All you have to do is pop in your text and go. So there's a link there on this slide. And again, my name is Bex. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the creative director and an inclusive design consultant of McKnight Inclusive Design. And that was how to be a digital accessibility leader in an hour or less.
But Bex, thank you very much for a great presentation. So much information there. But again, if you guys want to reach out to Bex, all her information is there. What a great presentation. Again, if you want to rewatch this, we'll be sending these out. They are recorded. So Bex, again, on behalf of Next Niagara and everybody here, just a big thank you for this really informative and really important conversation that we need to start having. And I hope to see everybody in the networking seminar session in a couple minutes.